The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast harsh shadows across the bustling terminal as passengers hurried to their gates, wheeling suitcases and clutching boarding passes. Among the crowd, one figure moved differently, slower, more deliberate. Tom Mitchell, 68, wore a faded denim jacket over a simple gray t-shirt, his weathered hands gripping the handles of a worn duffel bag. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, but his clothes suggested a man of modest means, perhaps a retiree visiting family. Tom approached the TSA checkpoint with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing rarely solved anything. The security line snaked through the cordoned area, filled with business travelers checking their phones and families corralling excited children. He waited his turn, observing the controlled chaos with eyes that had seen far more chaotic situations. Next, called Agent Sarah Martinez from behind the document checker station. Tom shuffled forward, presenting his driver's license and boarding pass. Martinez glanced at the documents, then at the man before her. Something about his posture, the way he carried himself despite his casual appearance, caught her attention. "Business or pleasure, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked routinely. "Just visiting an old friend," Tom replied, his voice gravelly but kind. Before continuing, give this story a like and subscribe to discover more tales of heroes hiding in plain sight, whose true valor only emerges when the world needs them most. As Tom moved through the metal detector, it remained silent. He collected his belongings from the conveyor belt, methodically checking that everything was accounted for. His duffel bag had been flagged for additional screening, a common occurrence that didn't seem to faze him. "Sir, we need to inspect your bag," announced Agent Rodriguez, a younger officer eager to demonstrate his thoroughness. Tom nodded and stepped aside, watching as Rodriguez unzipped the duffel. Inside were the typical contents of an elderly traveler: folded clothes, a small toiletry bag, a paperback novel, and some personal items. But nestled between a pair of jeans and a sweater was a small metal case that immediately drew Rodriguez's attention. "What's in here?" Rodriguez asked, lifting the case. "Personal effects," Tom answered simply. Rodriguez opened the case to reveal several military medals, their ribbons faded but the metal still gleaming. Among them were decorations that the young agent didn't recognize, medals with distinctive designs and foreign inscriptions. His training kicked in: unusual items, elderly traveler, potential security concern. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor," Rodriguez announced. Tom's expression didn't change. He'd been through worse delays than airport security, though he hoped his friend Marcus wouldn't worry if his flight was delayed. They hadn't seen each other in 3 years, not since Marcus's wife passed away. Supervisor Janet Walsh arrived within minutes, her sharp eyes immediately focusing on the opened case. She picked up one of the medals, turning it over in her hand. The inscription was in Vietnamese, and there were others with symbols she couldn't identify. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to come with me for additional screening," Walsh said, her tone professional but firm. "Is there a problem?" Tom asked, though his question carried no irritation, only mild curiosity. "Just standard procedure for certain items. This shouldn't take long." But as they walked toward the secondary screening area, Walsh was already formulating questions in her mind. The medals looked authentic, but in today's security environment, she couldn't take any chances. The combination of an elderly man with foreign military decorations traveling alone had triggered protocols that required further investigation. Tom was led to a small, windowless room with fluorescent lighting and 2 plastic chairs. The institutional smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mixing with the distant sounds of the busy airport beyond the walls. "I'll need to make some calls to verify these items," Walsh explained, settling into the chair across from him. Tom simply nodded, settling back in his chair with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Outside, flights continued to board and depart, but inside this small room, time seemed to slow down as an ordinary-looking elderly man waited for bureaucracy to run its course. Unaware that his simple trip to visit a friend was about to become anything but ordinary. The small interrogation room had grown stuffy over the past 2 hours. Tom Mitchell sat with his hands folded in his lap, occasionally glancing at his watch, not from impatience, but from concern about his friend Marcus, who would be waiting at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. Tom had promised to arrive by evening, and Marcus had planned dinner at their favorite restaurant from their younger days. Supervisor Janet Walsh returned with a folder and a laptop computer, accompanied by Agent Kevin Foster from Airport Security's investigative unit. Foster was a former police detective who prided himself on reading people, but the elderly man across from him presented an enigma. "Mr. Mitchell, we've been trying to verify the authenticity of these medals," Walsh began, opening the metal case again. "Some of them have markings and inscriptions we can't immediately identify." Tom looked at the medals laid out on the table. Each one represented not just an honor, but memories he rarely shared with anyone. "They're real," he said quietly. "Earned them a long time ago." "Can you tell us about your military service?" Foster asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "Served my country when it asked me to," Tom replied. "Did my job, came home, moved on with my life." Foster frowned at the nonspecific answer. "Mr. Mitchell, we need more details. These medals suggest extensive overseas service, possibly in combat zones. There's what appears to be Vietnamese writing on this one, and this other one has symbols we can't identify." Tom studied the two men across from him. In his experience, some stories were meant to be told, and others were meant to be kept. "I was in Vietnam, served multiple tours, did some work in other places too." "What kind of work?" Walsh pressed. "The kind that needed doing." The vague answers were beginning to frustrate Foster. He'd run preliminary checks on Thomas Mitchell and found a surprisingly sparse record for someone who apparently had extensive military service. "Mr. Mitchell, your military records seem to be limited. Can you explain why?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Some records get classified, some get buried, some get forgotten by everyone except the people who lived them." Meanwhile, Walsh had been making calls to various military verification services, but each inquiry seemed to hit dead ends or require higher clearance levels. One contact at the Pentagon had put her on hold for 20 minutes before telling her that any information about Thomas Mitchell would require authorization from levels far above her clearance. "Sir, we're going to need to hold you until we can verify your identity and the legitimacy of these items," Foster announced, closing his notepad with a snap. Tom nodded slowly. "Can I call my friend? He'll be worried if I don't show up." "In a while," Walsh said. "First, we need to complete our investigation." As the afternoon wore on, more officials became involved. The medals had been photographed and sent to military historians and experts. Database searches yielded confusing results, references to classified operations, redacted documents, and security protocols that seemed disproportionate for a simple airport screening. Agent Maria Santos, from the FBI field office, arrived around 4 p.m., having been called in when local searches began triggering federal security flags. She reviewed the file while Tom waited, noting the accumulating inconsistencies. "Gentlemen," she addressed Walsh and Foster, "I've never seen a case like this. Every inquiry about Mr. Mitchell gets referred to higher authorities. His name appears in connection with operations that are still classified decades later." In the interrogation room, Tom had remained calm, occasionally asking for water or to use the restroom, always polite and cooperative. But as the hours passed, his concern for Marcus grew. His friend had been battling depression since losing his wife, and Tom's visit was meant to provide some companionship and support. "Agent Santos," Foster said, joining her in the hallway, "what if this guy is some kind of security risk? The medals could be fake, his identity could be fabricated." Santos looked through the one-way mirror at Tom, who sat quietly with his eyes closed, appearing to meditate or perhaps just rest. "Or," she said slowly, "what if they're real and we've just detained someone we shouldn't have?" By 6 p.m., the small airport security office had transformed into an impromptu command center. Agent Santos had been joined by 2 additional FBI agents, while Pentagon liaisons participated via secure video conference. Tom Mitchell's simple trip to visit a friend had triggered a security response that surprised everyone involved. "Status report," demanded Colonel Patricia Hayes from her Pentagon office, her image sharp on the conference room screen. The assembled agents and security personnel straightened instinctively, even through video call. "Ma'am, we've detained a 68-year-old male, Thomas Mitchell, for possession of unverified military decorations," Santos reported. "Our attempts to verify his identity and service record have been complicated." "Complicated how?" Colonel Hayes asked. Agent Walsh consulted her notes. "Every database search triggers higher authorization requirements. His military records are either classified or don't exist in normal channels. The medals themselves have been authenticated as genuine by our experts, but some bear insignia from operations we can't identify." Colonel Hayes was quiet for several moments, her expression unreadable. "Describe the subject's behavior." "Completely cooperative," Foster answered. "Calm, polite, patient. He's asked about calling his friends several times, but hasn't become agitated. It's almost like he expected this to happen." In the interrogation room, Tom had indeed expected complications. When you've spent decades in situations where your official existence was documented in files that most people would never see, civilian bureaucracy was bound to create confusion. He was more concerned about Marcus than about himself. The door opened, and Agent Santos entered alone, carrying a cup of coffee and a sandwich. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize for the delay. I brought you something to eat." "Thank you," Tom said, accepting the food gratefully. "Have you been able to reach my friend yet?" Santos sat across from him, her approach more conversational than interrogative. "We're still working on that. Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, are you who you say you are?" Tom took a bite of the sandwich and considered the question. "I'm exactly who I say I am. The question is whether your systems are equipped to understand who that is." "Help me understand," Santos said. "Your military records are classified at levels that my clearance can't access. You carry medals from operations that apparently don't officially exist, yet you dress like a retiree and travel economy class to visit a friend." Tom smiled for the first time all day. "Agent Santos, the most important work often gets done by people you'd never notice in a crowd. The uniforms and the medals don't make the hero. They just mark what happened after the heroism was already done." Meanwhile, in the conference room, Colonel Hayes had made several calls to increasingly senior Pentagon officials. The case of Thomas Mitchell was climbing the chain of command at an unprecedented rate for what had begun as a routine airport screening. "Colonel, we've got authorization to access higher classification levels," announced Agent Rodriguez, who had been working with Pentagon IT specialists. "You might want to see this." As classified files began populating their screens, the assembled security personnel grew quiet. Tom Mitchell's official record painted a picture of 3 decades of service in places and operations that most Americans never knew existed. Vietnam, Cambodia, classified missions in South America, training programs for Allied forces, and operations that were still redacted even at Santos's clearance level. "Jesus," whispered Walsh, reading over Rodriguez's shoulder. "Look at these commendations." The list was extensive. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Combat V, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, and dozens of foreign decorations from grateful Allied nations. But more telling were the classified mission reports that described a soldier who consistently volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, who had saved countless lives, and who had been instrumental in operations that changed the course of regional conflicts. "There's more," Rodriguez said, his voice hushed. "Cross-references show he was involved in rescuing POWs, training resistance fighters, and leading evacuation operations. His last official assignment was training Special Forces units in counterterrorism techniques. Colonel Hayes had been reading the same files from her Pentagon office. When she spoke again, her tone had changed completely. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand something. Thomas Mitchell isn't just a veteran. He's a legend that most people in the military have never heard of because his work was too classified to acknowledge publicly. In the interrogation room, Tom finished his sandwich and checked his watch again. Marcus would be worried by now, probably calling Tom's cell phone repeatedly. Tom hoped his friend wouldn't assume the worst, that Tom had changed his mind about visiting, or worse, that something had happened to him. The door opened again, and this time Agent Santos entered with a different expression entirely. Behind her came Colonel Hayes herself, having flown from Washington on a military transport as soon as she'd confirmed Tom's identity. "Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying deep respect, "I believe we owe you an apology." Colonel Hayes stood at attention as she entered the small interrogation room, her crisp uniform a stark contrast to Tom Mitchell's casual travel clothes. The assembled agents and security personnel crowded behind her, their earlier suspicion replaced by something approaching awe. "Sir," Colonel Hayes began, then caught herself. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Colonel Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Security Division. I need to apologize on behalf of everyone involved in this situation." Tom looked up from his empty coffee cup, his expression unchanged. "No apology necessary, Colonel. These folks were doing their jobs." "Sir, with respect, they were doing their jobs on someone whose service record reads like a library of classified heroism," Hayes replied. "I've spent the last 2 hours reading files that required authorization from the Secretary of Defense himself." Agent Santos stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Mitchell, we had no idea." "Your records are classified for good reason," Tom interrupted gently. "Some operations need to stay quiet to protect people who are still alive, both our people and others." Colonel Hayes opened a secure tablet and began reading from Tom's file. "Silver Star for gallantry in action while serving as a forward observer in Vietnam, calling in artillery strikes on his own position when overrun by enemy forces. Bronze Star with V device for leading a rescue mission to extract a downed pilot behind enemy lines. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters for wounds received in combat." "Colonel," Tom said quietly, "that was a long time ago." "Sir, that's just the beginning," Hayes continued. 3 classified operations in Cambodia where you led indigenous forces in disrupting supply lines. Training mission in El Salvador where you developed counterinsurgency tactics still used today. Evacuation operation in Iran that saved 43 American hostages the public never knew existed. Tom's weather-beaten hands rested calmly on the table as Hayes recounted decades of classified service. Each mission mentioned represented months or years of his life spent in places where failure meant death, not just for him, but for the people depending on him. The Medal of Freedom recommendation that was classified and never awarded publicly, Hayes went on. The foreign decorations from 7 different allied nations. "Mr. Mitchell, you've been personally thanked by 3 presidents and 2 kings. And now I fix lawn mowers in a shop in Colorado Springs," Tom said with a slight smile. "Life moves on, Colonel." Agent Foster, who had been skeptical throughout the afternoon, now looked stunned. "Mr. Mitchell, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you explain who you were?" Tom considered the question carefully. "Agent Foster, the moment you start trading on past glory, you stop being the person who earned that glory in the first place. I'm not special because of what I did 40 years ago. I'm just a man trying to visit his friend." Colonel Hayes closed her tablet and looked directly at Tom. "Sir, Marcus Williams, retired Sergeant First Class, 82nd Airborne, you served together in Vietnam. He's been calling the airport every 30 minutes since your flight was supposed to land. He's a good friend," Tom said, his concern evident for the first time all day. "He lost his wife last year. I promised to visit." "Mr. Mitchell," Hayes said, her voice softer now, Sergeant Williams called the Pentagon 2 hours ago. He was worried something had happened to you, and he told us that if we were holding the bravest man he'd ever known, we'd better have a damn good reason." The room fell silent as the implications of the day's events settled on everyone present. They had detained a genuine American hero because his humility and ordinary appearance didn't match their expectations of what heroism looked like. "Sir," Colonel Hayes continued, "I have a military transport standing by to take you to Washington immediately." "It's the least we can do." Tom shook his head. "That's kind of you, but I have a ticket on a commercial flight. Marcus will meet me at the civilian terminal. He doesn't like military bases much anymore, too many memories." Agent Santos had been quiet, processing everything they'd learned. "Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, how do you do it? How do you go from saving lives in classified operations to fixing lawn mowers and flying economy class?" Tom stood up slowly, his joints protesting after 6 hours in the plastic chair. "Agent Santos, the real question isn't how you step down from glory. It's how you find purpose in ordinary life. Marcus and I, we found our purpose in being good neighbors, fixing things that are broken, helping people who need help. The uniform doesn't make the hero. The hero is what you choose to be every day after you take the uniform off." Colonel Hayes extended her hand. "Mr. Mitchell, it has been an honor. If there's ever anything at all, that you need, you call me directly." Tom shook her hand firmly. "There is one thing, Colonel. Marcus has been fighting some battles that don't make the history books: depression, loneliness, survivor's guilt. The kind of fights that don't have medals. Maybe instead of thanking old soldiers like us, we could do more to help them with the wars they're still fighting." The main terminal of Denver International Airport buzzed with its usual evening activity as Tom Mitchell finally emerged from the security offices, his worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Word of the afternoon's events had spread quietly among the airport staff, and several TSA agents nodded respectfully as he passed, though Tom seemed oblivious to the attention. Agent Santos walked with him toward his rescheduled flight, carrying a letter of apology from the TSA and a promise that his travel would never be delayed for these reasons again. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that what happened today will change how we handle veterans' cases. Just treat everyone with dignity, Agent Santos. That's all any of us can ask for." At the gate, passengers were boarding the delayed evening flight to Washington, D.C. Tom joined the line with economy-class travelers, declining the first-class upgrade that Agent Santos had arranged as an apology. "Marcus is meeting me at the economy exit," he explained. "He'd worry if I didn't come out where he expected." As he settled into his middle seat between a businessman and a college student, Tom appeared to be exactly what he looked like: an elderly man in simple clothes, traveling to visit a friend. The college student, absorbed in her phone, never looked up. The businessman, reviewing spreadsheets on his laptop, occasionally glanced with mild annoyance at Tom's worn jacket. Tom didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that the most meaningful journeys often happened in complete anonymity. The missions that had defined his military career were successful precisely because he could blend into any crowd, appear ordinary while accomplishing the extraordinary. The flight to Washington was smooth, and Tom spent most of it looking out the window at the lights of small towns passing below. Each cluster of lights represented families, communities, people living quiet lives that were no less valuable than the dramatic operations that filled his classified files. At Dulles Airport, Marcus Williams waited in his wheelchair near baggage claim, wearing his old Army jacket despite the warm evening. At 70, Marcus had been battling diabetes and depression since losing his wife, but his face lit up when he spotted Tom emerging from the terminal. "Tommy," Marcus called out, using the nickname from their Army days. "I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind about visiting an old crippled soldier." Tom embraced his friend carefully, mindful of the wheelchair and the oxygen tank attached to it. "Sorry I'm late, Marcus. Had some complications at the airport." "TSA giving you trouble? I told you that beard makes you look suspicious." Marcus laughed, the first genuine laugh Tom had heard from him in months. As they made their way to Marcus's modified van, Tom listened to his friend talk about the restaurant where they'd have dinner, the museum they'd visit tomorrow, the stories Marcus wanted to share about his late wife. The Pentagon files full of classified heroism seemed distant and unimportant compared to this simple mission, spending time with a friend who needed companionship. "Tommy," Marcus said, as they drove through the Virginia suburbs, "I got to admit something. When you didn't show up on time, I got scared. Started thinking maybe I was losing another friend. Started thinking maybe I wasn't worth the trip." Tom looked at his friend, seeing not the decorated paratrooper who had saved Tom's life in a Vietnamese jungle, but a lonely widow of fighting battles that didn't make headlines. "Marcus, you're worth every mile I've ever traveled. The most important missions don't come with orders from commanding officers. They come from promises we make to people we care about." At the restaurant, a small Italian place where they'd celebrated their safe return from Vietnam 50 years earlier, Tom listened more than he talked. He listened to Marcus's stories about his grandchildren, his concerns about his health, his memories of his wife. To the other diners, they appeared to be two elderly men sharing a quiet meal, unremarkable in their ordinariness. But Tom understood that this was heroism too, showing up for a friend, listening to someone's pain, offering presence in place of solutions. The classified operations of his youth had been about protecting strangers. This mission was about protecting someone who mattered deeply to him. As they sat over coffee, Marcus grew serious. "Tommy, I need to tell you something. There were days this year when I didn't want to wake up. But knowing you were coming to visit, knowing someone still cared enough to travel across the country to see me, that gave me a reason to keep going." Tom reached across the table and placed his weathered hand on his friend's arm. "Marcus, heroes aren't just the people who charge enemy positions or lead rescue missions. Heroes are the people who get up every morning and keep fighting battles that nobody else can see. You're the bravest man I know." Outside the restaurant, the lights of Washington, D.C. stretched toward the horizon, illuminating monuments to recognized heroes whose names were carved in stone. But inside, two old soldiers sat sharing coffee and conversation, proving that the truest heroism often happens in moments too quiet for monuments, too ordinary for medals, and too important to ever be forgotten by the people whose lives they touch. Tom Mitchell had spent 6 hours being detained at an airport, had triggered security responses reaching the highest levels of the Pentagon, and had been recognized as a classified hero whose exploits most Americans would never know. But his most important mission of the day was accomplished over coffee and conversation with a friend who needed to know that someone still cared, a reminder that real heroes never stop serving, they just find new ways to save lives.